Hey, what's up everyone? Ben at ProFixer, and today on the channel we're going to be talking about how to remove and reapply thermal paste on a console. Here in front of me I have a PS4, but this will work for a console or realistically any type of decapped processor that you're wanting to re-thermal paste. Everything that I have on Workbench is linked up in the description below, so be sure to check that out, and also don't forget to subscribe to the channel and also like this video. And be sure to comment below what you want to see in future videos. Without further ado, let's get started on this PS4, and I'm going to show you how to re-thermal paste it. Here in front of me on the bench, I have one of the original PS4s. This is the one with the capacitive touch power button and eject button. It's deemed like the fat PS4. That's kind of the nickname that it got just because of the size, because they came out with the slims later on, and this particular one is in need of a re-thermal pasting. This particular one actually was given to us by a customer. They said they tried to fix it, all this kind of stuff. We got busy, we put it on the shelf, and they actually wanted to recycle it, so just left it as far as just basically trash. I did notice as well, once we pulled this apart, that the HDMI port is, well, I didn't actually notice it was falling off, but we're gonna fix this one in a future video. But this PS4, or this HDMI port, is completely falling off, and every single pad except for probably like two are completely torn off. So we're going to be repairing this in a future video, but in today's video I'm going to show you how you can re-thermal paste and some of the techniques with that. So the first thing that you want to do with thermal paste is remove any of the thermal paste that was originally on there. Something that works really good is isopropyl alcohol. We use 99% isopropyl alcohol. It works really good to remove any of the residue. So what I always do, I always take a Q-tip first and work on the dry paste. A lot of times if it's really dry, it may be super hard to get off, or it may just actually kind of like flake off, kind of like clay. But either way, just kind of push that off of the heatsink backing there, and you have a bit built up on the Q-tip. And then you want to go ahead and take your motherboard side and remove that. So something cool to understand about these is this is called a decapped processor. A lot of you may have experience with building PCs at home. A lot of those, actually basically just about every single one of them, are going to be capped processors. Essentially, a capped processor is going to look completely silver and smooth on top. Thermal pasting is different depending on if it's capped or if it's decapped. So that is something to keep in mind. This is going to be for a decapped processor. A lot of laptop processors are the same way. And they look just like this PS4 processor, and so this will be applying directly to that. Once you have all of the old thermal paste removed and you have most of the residue taken off, I'm actually going to wipe some of that off the top of the processor here. You then need to use a little bit of isopropyl alcohol. So I don't like to douse the processor, but just go ahead and put it on the Q-tip. It's okay if it drips. And then you're going to go ahead and just clean this up. Pretty simple process. Just make sure that you get it all off of there. One thing you probably noticed especially with PS4s, is they do have a lot of overflow on the processor itself of the thermal paste from the factory. That is actually one of the characteristics of re-thermaling a decapped processor. Whenever they're not capped, you actually have the actual processor right here in the middle, and that's going to be the actual shiny part. That's going to be what's producing all of the heat. If this was a capped processor, you'd actually have, over this whole thing, you'd have the full metal shield, like a big cap on it. Whenever you would thermal that, you would actually put a small dot and it would spread out, and it would spread to maybe about a dime or a quarter size, but it wouldn't spread over the full total cap. But it would spread enough to cover the actual die in the middle. The biggest thing to understand with this is whenever you look at a decapped processor, you'll notice that there's a little bit of overflow. Whenever you would compare that to a capped processor, you would actually start to see that the amount of overflow on a decapped, like this one is here, would match that of a capped processor. It covers right about half or maybe a third of the actual top of the processor. So something to keep in mind whenever you put new thermal paste on here. Don't be too afraid to add a bit of thermal paste and have it overflow just a tiny bit, because it's not going to actually hurt it. As long as you're really not getting all the thermal paste in the outside edges, then you're probably going to be just fine. But big thing here is let's go ahead and clean this up. Make sure that it's completely clean, no residue coming off. And then we're going to go ahead and clean this on this heatsink as well. So there we go. That one looks nice and shiny. So we're going to set that off to the side. And then we're going to go ahead and clean the back of this heatsink. Pretty easy process, much easier than doing the actual processor itself, just because it's completely flat. And one cool thing about these with this heatsink is you know exactly where the processor is going to touch because they have this cutout in the metal shield, and everything sits, you know, completely flat, or you know, completely in line. There's really no guesswork as far as where in the heatsink it's going to land. So the first thing to do whenever applying thermal paste is to understand there's a couple different techniques with it. You can do like a dot technique, which is pretty cool. The dot technique is basically the most simple process. You just basically put a dot on there, and then as you squish it up against your heatsink, it would then squish the dot down into like a flattened pancake, which would then cover your processor itself. The way that I'm going to show you today is going to be kind of like the smear technique, where you do put a dot on there, but then you smear out that dot to cover the actual die. This is something that I changed over to on consoles. The main reason for that is just because they're so low powered. That way of thermal pasting it seems to do a very, very good job. And it's actually very easy to know if you have the actual right amount of thermal paste on there from the get-go. Sometimes guesstimating on how large the dot needs to be and then training another employee or another tech on how to do and replicate that same process can be kind of hard, and then you get varying size dots going throughout your repair shop, and then you're really wondering if they're spreading to the proper amount. So the smear technique is a little more foolproof. You know for sure before putting your heatsink on if you actually have enough thermal paste. So I'm going to kind of show you what that is here. This particular thermal paste, I actually picked it up on Amazon, and it's just a very basic thermal paste. It's nothing like Arctic Silver or MX4 or anything like that. We'll have both of them linked up in the description, so we'll have Arctic Silver and then also this kind linked up. But in all of our tests, we have had no overheating issues and no operational issues, and so we continue to use this because it comes in huge syringes, which is incredibly convenient for our store. So what you'll do is go ahead and put essentially a dot. The amount of dot that you can see on there, that would be probably perfect if you're going to do the dot and squish technique. We're going to be doing that smear technique like I mentioned earlier. What you'll do is then take a business card, you could even take your finger if you're wearing gloves or something like that, and then smear it out. But the main thing is you want to wipe it along the top of the processor and just smear this out so it is completely covering the top. So we got one side done there, and then we can start to work this over to the other. And one of the big things with this is you want to try to avoid bubbles as much as possible. And this is actually one reason why I avoided this technique in the very beginning, is you do have a little bit less consistent surface. Whenever you have the dot technique, you put the dot on there and squish it out. And just by nature of the dot squishing, it actually squishes out all the bubbles in the process. This one here, you do actually introduce a little bit of voids, but it's such a low power processor that we haven't had any types of operational issues like I mentioned before. And then what you'll do is once you have the full thing covered, just go ahead and take your card and do one last swipe to make this as consistent as possible. There we go. And I'm actually going to come from the other side over here as well. I'm going to flip it because I noticed it is a little bit thinner on one side than the other. And there we go. That looks just about perfect. So this thermal paste here is completely covering the actual die, and it's a very, very thin layer. What you'll do with the residue that's left on your card is go ahead and smear that onto your heatsink itself. This is called tinting the heatsink. This helps with the break-in process, helps it to mate up to the heatsink and reach optimal running temperatures. This is actually a trick that I learned off the Arctic Silver website. To learn all about all the different ways of thermal pasting different processors and actually learning the actual manufacturer specific way, if you visit the Arctic Silver website, which we've linked up in the description below, they will actually show you if it needs the dot technique, the line technique, actually the smear technique, or whatever it may be, which is actually really, really cool. And it'll show you all the different ways, and actually it teaches you, depending on your processor layout of or the core layout of your actual processor, which technique is absolutely best. And it gives you visuals and things like that. So I'm going to put just a very tiny dot on here, and we are going to smear this. And that works perfect there. Basically just tinting the heatsink just enough to have a little bit of a residue on the actual heatsink backing. So just to kind of show you the spread and the contact that this would make, is I am going to insert this in here, insert the heatsink screws, and then I will show you kind of what it looks like. Whenever you're doing your own thermal paste, once you've applied the thermal paste, you don't want to lift up your motherboard and then lay it back down. The biggest issue with that is you're going to create voids and then trap air bubbles. Air bubbles don't transfer heat as well as actual thermal paste does, so you could actually have operational temperature issues if you lifted it and laid it back down. But just for demonstration purposes, to kind of show you how this lays down, how it spreads, and just the whole process itself, I will pull this back up just to show you in this particular video. So we have that there. I'm going to put this on the back, and then we're going to put in our heatsink screws. And this will be with a number 1 screwdriver. You can use a number 1 or a 0 screwdriver. Both of those seem to fit pretty good. And you never want to tighten down this little clamp all the way until you have both sides about even, and then tighten one side a few turns, and then just go back and forth until you have it butted up against the back plate itself. All right, so there we go. With the little clamp in place, it is applying pressure to the back of the motherboard, which is applying pressure to the processor, and then up against that heatsink. Let's go ahead and pull these screws out, and we're going to see that spread on there. All right, there we go. I'm going to pull that off. And then now this is the moment we've all been waiting for, to see the actual spread of the thermal paste. So pulling this one out, we can take a look at this here, and we can see that the pull on the thermal paste is pretty consistent throughout the whole thing. Basically covering all of the processor itself, has a nice imprint on both the processor and the heatsink, so that was enough thermal paste applied in order to have transferred all the heat properly as it should. But it's an incredibly simple way to remove and reapply thermal paste on your PS4. The spread technique, like I mentioned earlier, is, in my opinion, the most repeatable process that you can do. And once you get the hang of it, putting the dot on there, smearing it over, it'll be extremely consistent, and just about anybody can do it. And as long as you have the proper spread before, you can ensure that you have the proper coverage even afterwards. Versus with the dot technique, if you put too small of a dot or too large of a dot, it could spread too much or too little, causing different variances in how much heat your heatsink is able to transfer away from the processor, which could affect the gameplay and just the whole console itself. Well, I appreciate everyone that's still watching the video, and if you found it useful, go and hit the like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and please comment below letting us know what you want to see in future videos. But thanks again for watching, and I'll see you later.